Anyone can follow. It takes something special to be an original, which is why the 2025 Lincoln Navigator SUV arrives with new ways of surrounding you in luxury, including the ultra-wide 48-inch panoramic display and the multi-sensory Lincoln Rejuvenate experience. A true original never stops evolving. So meet the 2025 Navigator, the original that's all new and better than ever. Learn more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Navigator are trademarks of Ford or its affiliates.
Recently, we asked some people about sharing their New York Times accounts.
My name is Dana. I am a subscriber to the New York Times, but my husband isn't. And it would be really nice to be able to share a recipe or an article or compete with him in Wordle or connections. Thank you.
Dana, we heard you. Introducing the New York Times Family Subscription. One subscription, up to 4 separate logins for anyone in your life. Find out more at nytimes.com/family.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Got a car to sell but no time to waste? Hop on to Carvana.com to get a real offer for your car in seconds. All you have to do is enter your license plate, answer a few quick questions, and if you accept the offer, Carvana will pay you as soon as you hand the keys over. They even offer same-day pickup in many cities. Save your time, score some cash, and sell your car the convenient way to Carvana. Pickup times vary. Fees may apply.
The first casualty of war is the truth. That's the old saying, and in the case of Israel's war with Hamas, that saying is especially true. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name is Brian Lilly, your host, and today we try and push back the fog of war by turning to 2 experts on the subject, specifically experts in urban warfare, the kind that we're witnessing in Gaza City right now. Colonel Richard Kemp is a retired British Army officer who served in the Gulf War, Northern Ireland, Afghanistan, Iraq, Bosnia, and more. He's researched and written extensively on issues surrounding war in general, but urban warfare in particular. Also joining the program is Colonel John Spencer, a retired American Army officer who saw action in Iraq. He now studies urban warfare and is considered one of the world's leading experts on the subject. So much so that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu cited his work during his speech at the United Nations.
Colonel John Spencer, he's perhaps the world's greatest expert on urban warfare. And he says, Israel is applying more measures to minimize civilian casualties than any military in history. And because we're doing that, the ratio of non-combatant to combatant casualties is less than 2 to 1 in Gaza. That's an astoundingly low ratio, lower than NATO's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, especially when you consider that Gaza is one of the most densely populated urban areas on Earth.
Here's my conversation with Richard Kemp and John Spencer. I hope it brings you some truth. Well, gentlemen, let me start with the simple question, and it's one that it continues to be debated, and I know you've written on recently, John. The issue of genocide. This is the claim that is being used over and over again to vilify Israel. You've both been there. You both have thoughts. Before we get into details on how urban warfare is taking place, I just want to talk about that and some of the political moves, like Canada deciding to recognize a Palestinian state. What are your thoughts on genocide?
Age before beauty, Richard.
Yeah, okay, I'll speak. What I would say, maybe I'll let John speak more about the accusations of genocide against Israel. What I would say is that the accusations of genocide should be leveled against Hamas. Hamas is the genocidal entity in this particular conflict. They have, by the definition of their charter, which requires them to kill not just the Jews in Israel, but Jews everywhere. By that definition, they are genocidal terrorists. By their actions on the 7th of October, which itself was an act of genocide, by their words since the 7th of October, in which they promised to repeat the 7th of October again and again and again, those are genocidal words. Now, they're not going to succeed in their genocide, but they certainly will have the best possible try they can. So they, in fact, are the genocidal players here in every possible respect. And the accusation against Israel is simply an obscenity. I'll let John speak perhaps more about that.
Yeah, Brian, for me, I'm an advocate for the law of armed conflict, for the rule of law, for all parties in an armed conflict to adhere to the law of armed conflict. What I'm not an advocate for is the political nature of accusations without actual veracity of the claim of the three crimes in the law of armed conflict: war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Genocide being, of course, the most egregious human thing that could ever be done. And it has very specific definitions. Words have meaning. Like, I don't mind as much the useful idiots, the sheer ignorance of the man or woman on the street wearing a Hamas headband and advocating for Hamas. But I do mind when governments join the bandwagon despite the case that's been laid out against Israel, despite the reality on the ground. Even if you don't go to Gaza like Richard and I have multiple times, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to say, okay, what's the accusation, or what is the evidence, information even, because there is no evidence, information that you're using to wage this libel against Israel, like genocidal specific intent. Oh, you have these statements, but what's the full statement? What does that person say that statement means? Why do you rule out any information like in genocide? So for the intent, where they might say, Prime Minister of Israel said, remember Amalek in the opening days after October 7th, which is a very famous term that's on the Holocaust Memorial in The Hague and in Israel, which means remember those that are rising up to destroy you. But then they won't use the speech he gives a day later saying, our war is against Hamas, not the people of Gaza. Same thing for all other statements. And then the evidence, if they can't prove intent, is the numbers, which is just any form of lies, damn lies, statistics, whether it's the starvation claim, which is false, and they want to rule out everything Israel has done to feed the enemy's population, to vaccinate everybody in Gaza. All of the information is like, it's an assault on critical thinking even if I wasn't a war researcher, it's just an assault on critical thinking. Like, how could you say these statements? And of course, I know that every country that said it is really advocating for the domestic politics position because they feel the pressure. And you need true leadership to say, this is not even in the world of reality of what's going on the ground.
You mentioned the food situation, John. Both of you are veterans of war. Have you ever fought in a war where you had to feed your enemy, provide them clean drinking water and electricity? Because that I don't think a lot of people know that Israel has been providing the power and the water and then the food, and then told, well, you're not giving them enough food. You're committing genocide. I don't know how you commit genocide against a people that you are feeding and watering.
I think the Israelis have been facilitating, sometimes by direct assistance, they've been facilitating significantly more humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip than is required by the population of the Gaza Strip, significantly more. And I think I'm right in saying that, certainly in my knowledge and my experience, this is the first time in history that any army, any armed force, or any opposing power has facilitated the delivery of aid to the enemy population at the same time as they're fighting that enemy. Yeah, we've got examples from history of, one side wins a conflict and it provides aid in various forms to the power that it has defeated. But never to my knowledge, while this conflict has been going on. But that's what we've been seeing. Exactly.
Normally, you lay siege to a place. You cut off the access to food and water as a way to try and get them to surrender. Here, they're actively delivering more aid than the UN will pick up at times.
Absolutely. And we've seen stockpiles of aid waiting inside Gaza that have been permitted in by the IDF, have been checked, searched, allowed in, and then they're waiting. It's waiting there because the UN have a completely inefficient distribution system. And the UN itself has admitted that the vast majority of the aid that it has brought into Gaza has been hijacked and taken over by Hamas and used for Hamas's purposes. And of course, that's what Hamas is trying to do with aid. Hamas aren't interested in the population being fed. In fact, they'd rather the population weren't fed so they can perpetrate their own lies about starvation. What Hamas want, they want to control the population through distribution of aid, which is often sold free aid given by US taxpayers' dollars. Free aid. They want to sell that. They've been selling that at vastly inflated prices to those that can afford it. They've been keeping their own aid. They've been keeping a lot of the aid back for their obese terrorists that have been hiding in their tunnels. And so they've been raising funds and controlling the population by it. And this is one of the main reasons why they have opposed so strongly the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has been the most effective organization, a US initiative supported by Israel as well, mainly made up of former American soldiers, been distributing aid directly to the Gazans, bypassing Hamas, so Hamas don't get control of it and don't use it to raise funds or control the population. And that's why they oppose it. And another obscenity, I mentioned genocide as an obscenity, another obscenity in this propaganda war against Israel is that the United Nations and other NGOs that are supposed to be responsible for food distribution, they themselves are as strong an opposer of the Gaza Humanitarian Fund as Hamas are. So you've got the United Nations, organizations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, various aid organizations working hand in hand with Hamas against Israel and against the population of Gaza.
What should listeners make of the claims that Israel has used, and I think it was specific to the aid being distributed by the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, that they have used that as a lure to get people to show up so they can shoot and kill them?
I mean, it's as false as all the other claims. It doesn't stand up against evidence, and it rules out any information from anybody but Hamas. So those claims are Hamas claims, then Hamas casualty numbers, and people won't even listen to what Israel says. Okay, fine, you think that Israel is lying, but they won't use what the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, not Israelis, mostly American, but other country veterans who are on the ground, and no matter how many videos they say, this is not true. This is what happened on this day. This is what happened on that day. This is how Hamas snuck a grenade into the line with people trying to get food or whatever. It's just not true. And no matter how far they reach for an allegation or I got you to Israel doing something wrong, they won't listen to any just basic information that conflicts with that Hamas information, because where they're getting the information is unequivocally from Hamas, the Gaza Health Ministry. They'll put different names on it, but most of the international organizations like UN at this point won't even name Hamas when armed militias grab all 90% of the aid or something. So it's another false claim with very little evidence. Has there been chaos in the initial phases of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation? Although if you go to people that are there now, like this week, it's a very finely to run humanitarian operation in the midst of war. And this is where people will say, I've never seen such chaos. I'm like, well, have you ever seen humanitarian aid delivery in war? Like the Somalian war when we tried to do it in other locations? Actually, what the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation should be applauded, should be awarded for what they're doing to feed despite Hamas and these lies, like thousands of people get shot. It's just not factual.
I can tell you from a media perspective, making sure that it is labeled information from Hamas is quite difficult because, like every media organization, Post Media, National Post, Toronto Sun, we all rely on wire services. Everybody, you either subscribe to AP or Reuters, and they have just taken to putting in Gaza Health Ministry without pointing out that is Hamas. And so you're fighting against this misinformation constantly or trying to correct it. It is incredibly difficult. But the food situation on the ground now, you said it's a lot calmer now, although still chaotic because it's a war zone. Has Hamas effectively weaponized food in this war as another front? Because I would say while Hamas is not winning the war militarily, they appear to be winning on the PR side. They get a lot of great PR. To me, it feels like they really weaponize this food issue to turn hearts and minds, even as they're losing in the battlefield.
That's exactly what they've done, and one of the means of doing that is okay. It may not be a major contributor, but it certainly influences people. One of the means of doing that is to have made up films, and Bollywood or Pallywood, as it's known, is a long-standing Palestinian, particularly Hamas, tradition of making up films and getting people to pretend they're dead when they're not, getting people to be seriously wounded when they're not, all of that sort of stuff going on an industrial scale actually in Gaza since this war began and long before that. And you see examples, some of the most outstanding examples in the media of famine, starvation, etc., have been proven to be people who are not starving. They've been proven in some cases to be unfortunate children who are suffering from pre-existing diseases which give them a skeletal type appearance.
I think you're talking about the New York Times front page.
Right, the New York Times front page and many, many other front pages on the internet and in print of the media, including the BBC, which is one of the worst offenders, I might say. Now, if they need to do that, if they need to falsify it to that extent, that tells you something I think that's quite important, which is why aren't they just using the real evidence of it if there is real evidence? Well, the reality is there isn't real evidence. I'm not saying there isn't hunger in Gaza. I'm sure there is hunger in Gaza, largely brought about by Hamas. But I've seen a lot of people in Gaza. I've spoken directly to at least 100 Gazans, civilians. Not one of them that I saw showed any sign of starvation. Yeah, some of them are a bit thinner than normal, but that's probably actually more healthy than many people in the West are. But there was no sign of starvation, and the people I saw were active, were moving around, were happy to be receiving for the first ever time free aid since the war began, and that came from the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. So this is just some of the examples of the way that Hamas have been manipulating, weaponizing food and starvation against Israel. And it's been swallowed up by a gullible media and obviously people who don't know any better, who watch that media.
So, Brian, I'd like to come in on this because to say that Hamas has weaponized the food that's gone into Gaza since October 7th is almost putting it lightly. As I said in the beginning, I'm an advocate for the law of armed conflict at both sides. But for some reason in this war, Hamas gets a pass on any atrocity they commit or any violation of the law of armed conflict, using the hospitals, using the humanitarian zones. Where was Mohammed Def killed? Right next to the Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone. Just the sheer human sacrifice strategy that they use, the fact that the civilians aren't allowed in their tunnels, the fact that every sack of flour, every grain of rice that's entered Gaza is under Hamas's control. They grab it and hoard it for themselves. They tax it and have civilians sell it to other civilians, and that's how they pay their fighters to keep fighting. I mean, it's just the hypocrisy is that the international media, though, reporting only on Israel and saying everything that's awful in this war is Israel's fault. And they don't even mention Hamas in their reporting. And if you can be objective as possible and say, I'm not on anybody's side, then at least report the information of like what's going in not just food, but water, medical services, the patients that are coming out that Israel facilitates Gazans to go get medical aid. It's to say that it's just the Hamas weaponizes the food, everything they do, to include killing civilians who have tried to get to aid, who are actually hungry and trying to get food for their people. And they see the whole warehouse full of sugar, flour, Nutella, you name it. It's just hypocrisy.
But their tactics have worked, and we saw that this week at the United Nations with Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Australia, I believe Portugal as well, all saying we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Without the weaponization of the food, the Pallywood that you mentioned, Richard, without all of that, they don't get that recognition. Now, they've said it's a fruit of October 7th. In this instance, I believe Hamas, our leaders, have tried to say, no, that's not the case. This is not a reward for terrorism. I disagree on that front. But one of the things that Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said that I think is incredibly naive is that Canada's recognition, which we've already given, is predicated on Hamas having no role in the governance of Gaza or the Palestinian state going forward, and that they be disarmed. I think Israel is in the middle of trying to disarm them, and they're being told to stop. Can Hamas be disarmed without a military victory by Israel?
Well, the answer to that question is obviously no, it can't. And it won't be without the military victory by Israel. And if Prime Minister Carney, or indeed his fellow recognisers like Prime Minister Starmer in England, if they think that them laying down the condition for a two-state solution, which actually is not even slightly on the cards at the moment, and probably not in the future, if they think they can lay down a condition for that as being that Hamas are disarmed or Hamas don't form any part of the government, then what levers do they have to do that? What power do they have to do it? They have none. They're not. What they're saying is not serious statements, but in fact, recognition of a so-called state of Palestine is not a serious thing either. And they're not doing it because they think it is. I'm speaking as far as Britain's concerned, and France as well. I'm sure the same applies to Canada. The reason that they're doing this is not because they think it's going to make any difference whatsoever to anything in the Middle East, but because they're under severe pressure from their anti-Israel electorates. And I'm not saying that there's a majority of anti-Israel electorates in either of those three countries, but there are certainly a significant wedge of it. Pressure from their anti-Israel electorates to take this action. And certainly in the case of Starmer in the UK, he's in a very weak position politically, and he is dependent on an alliance of his hard left and Islamic supporters in Parliament and in the electorate to take this sort of action against Israel, plus his earlier action of a partial arms embargo on Israel. So that's the reason they're doing it. It's purely political expediency on their part, and they don't seem to recognise that not only is it going to have no effect in terms of the conflict in the Middle East, and there isn't going to be a two-state solution, but what they don't recognise is something that's even more dangerous, which is that it is certainly a reward for terrorism, and it certainly will encourage terrorism, and it certainly will encourage international jihadists in their own countries. And we've got a big problem in Britain. France has, other European countries have as well, of jihadism in our countries, which has been shown by numerous attacks in the past. These people are still there. They're still planning attacks, and they're going to be encouraged by this craven bowing and genuflecting to terrorists. And I would say if Israel doesn't succeed in defeating Hamas, which I believe it will, but if it didn't succeed in that, and if Carney and Starmer and co had their way, it wouldn't, then that is a major encouragement for terrorism everywhere.
You've both been in Gaza. How do you disarm Hamas without defeating them? The tunnels, the hidden weapons caches, that's serious work. And what's Carney talking about? He just wants Israel to end the war. He wants to made it sound like a blue beret unit going in and doing peacekeeping, like it's walking the green line in Cyprus in 1964. Give me a break.
Yeah, this is where I'm glad that I don't do politics. I do war, which is politics by other means. I understand the politics. I'm glad the American leadership hasn't drank this insanity Kool-Aid. Criticism is fine, and I'm all about criticism, but criticism without solutions is just noise, and that's the point where you're at. The fact that you would say these things but not have any solution to getting to a point where any entity other than the IDF could survive in Gaza at the point of Hamas's power right now, not addressing the radicalization, right? So this is the ideal that why Hamas started October 7th has nothing to do with the two-state solution. what even the Palestinian Authority wants Gaza for has nothing to do with living in coexistence and to give up terrorism. All these things that all politicians before these weak leaders have tried to address the Palestinian pursuit for a state in all of the terms of where is the border, what are the conditions, do you recognize, do you give up terrorism? They don't want to address any of that, and they've actually made it harder. And this is where I say there are some with blood on their hands. And to be clear, the people who have made it harder to defeat Hamas, every one of these statements has hardened Hamas's positions. Because you can win a war without killing every individual in an opposite military. War is a contest of will. They have to lose the will to believe they can win the war. Right now, thanks to Canada, UK, all these people, Hamas is hardened in his position. Like, oh, we have a chance here. We have a chance to win.
They walked away from the negotiating table on a ceasefire when our countries all said, yes, we'll recognize the state. I mean, so you're absolutely right, John. They were at the table, the Americans, Qataris, Egyptians, all trying to get them to come to a ceasefire agreement. Oh, wait, we're going to get recognized? We don't need to be here anymore.
Well, you mentioned Egypt, and I can't go with that interview without saying every country of the world, all of these countries, all those United Nations countries that made their useless statements, not one of them will point out that all of the suffering, every single aspect of the human suffering happening in Gaza because of Hamas could be alleviated tomorrow by opening the gate to Egypt and creating a humanitarian zone just a few kilometers outside of Hamas's reaches. But not a single one of these people mention it like this is ahistorical. This has never happened in war before, where a single country closes this gate and puts up a new wall saying, look, have your war, but not a single civilian. I'm not going to help a single civilian. That's the insanity of these political statements, is that there is a solution that would help everybody get to the solution of Hamas being disarmed and removed from power. It's get them their human shields, their human sacrifice out of their hands, and this would go very quickly.
I don't need to say this. I was going to say John is right, but I don't need to say that because John is, of course, always right. But the other question to add to that is why have Western countries and why have all these mighty humanitarian organizations, the United Nations, why have they not pressured Egypt into opening its borders? Why have they not done that? And they haven't. All they need to do is pay. They'd pay. Egypt is in dire financial situation. Egypt could be pressured and paid to do this, in my view. Now, I can understand in a way why Egypt doesn't want to do it. I get Egypt's perspective on it. But I don't understand why the West won't force them to do so. Well, I do understand it, actually, and I'm going to explain that, which is that I believe that Western countries like the UK and like other European countries, and probably Canada as well, just as Hamas want to use Gazan civilians as human shields, I believe that our countries also want to use Gazan civilians as human shields in a slightly different way, as human shields against an Israeli victory. They do not want Israel to beat Hamas. And maintaining the presence of those civilians inside Gaza helps them in that cause. So they are happier. They would be happier, I think, to see, although they wouldn't admit it, and they probably wouldn't even admit it themselves, but for their own political purposes, they'd be happy to see those Gaza civilians die than seeing them escape out of Gaza into Egypt. And you hear this talk, you hear constant talk. Gaza is an open prison. Gaza is a concentration camp. But they say, these politicians say, but the prisoners and the inmates in those camps must stay there. They must stay. They mustn't be allowed to leave. This is absolutely diabolical. And John said the words blood on their hands a short while ago. These people have blood on their hands, without a doubt, the blood of both innocent Gazan civilians and also of Israeli soldiers and Israeli hostages.
All right, we need to take a quick break for a moment, a few ads. But when we come back, I do want to talk about the offensive in Gaza City. What makes that so dangerous? Can they get the hostages back? And I know both of you have looked at civilian casualty rates, something that most in the media won't talk about. We'll get into that. Back in moments.
Netflix has a new, monstrous story to tell. In 1950s Wisconsin, Ed Gein lived quietly on a decaying farm, hiding a house of horrors so gruesome it would redefine the American nightmare. Driven by isolation, psychosis, and an all-consuming obsession with his mother, he committed crimes that would haunt Hollywood for decades. The third and most harrowing installment of Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan's anthology series. Watch Monster, the Ed Gein story, October 3rd, only on Netflix.
You're tuned into Auto Intelligence, live from Auto Trader, where data, tools, and your preferences sync to make your car shopping smooth.
They're searching inventory.
Oh, yeah.
They find what you need.
They're gonna find
and
it.
You can make a budget for your wallet to help you succeed. Pricing's precise and true.
So true.
It's smarter car shopping.
Ooh.
Just for you.
Oh, it's just for you. Ooh. Find your next ride at autotrader.com. Powered by Auto Intelligence.
Leading a business today means constantly adapting. On the Executive Insights podcast, brought to you by AWS, global leaders share how they're making tough calls, testing bold ideas, and putting innovation into practice, generative AI included. If you're looking for real stories behind what's working, this is it. Subscribe to the Executive Insights podcast today, available now on all major podcast platforms.
This is Tristan Hopper, the host of Canada Did What?, where we unpack the biggest, weirdest, and wildest political moments in Canadian history you thought you knew and tell you what really happened. Stick around at the end of the episode to hear a sample of one of our favorite episodes. If you don't want to stick around, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get podcasts.
Israel's offensive into Gaza City is getting a lot of attention now, gentlemen, and I'd like to get your thoughts. I had a colleague say, why are they just going into Gaza now? My guess is they have gone in and out of Gaza City over the course of this war, but it is a particular offensive right now. Are they just trying to clear out remnants of Hamas? Is that what they're trying to do at the moment, Richard?
Well, I would say that Gaza City may not be the final stronghold of Hamas, but it's certainly now, I think, the largest concentration of Hamas terrorists inside Gaza, although I'm sure many of them have left or tried to leave. But nevertheless, there's still a significant presence there. And of course, without taking Gaza City, without destroying Hamas inside Gaza City, then you don't destroy Hamas at all. So very clearly, they've got to deal with Gaza City. And that is a tough problem. It's a tough nut to crack, and it's a tough nut to crack. It wouldn't be so tough if it wasn't for the civilian presence there. I think there was an estimate of something like 2 million civilians inside Gaza City at the beginning of the IDF operation there a couple of weeks ago. I don't know if that's accurate or not. It's probably exaggerated, but it could be around the truth. But the IDF, I think, are estimating now that around 700, maybe even up to 900,000 Gazans have left Gaza City. And the IDF have been warning them by leaflet drops and by other means, numerous other means, to get out to safety and telling them where they can go to safety, in other words, to the south along designated routes. And a large number have been doing that. But of course, meanwhile, Hamas have been doing their best to prevent them from getting out of Gaza City because they want them there as human shields. They want as many Gazan civilians to die inside Gaza City as they possibly can. So that's what makes it a more difficult problem than it otherwise would have been. Another complexity, of course, is the presence there of the hostages. And I believe the IDF understand that there are at least some of the hostages inside Gaza City, and Hamas themselves have said they've threatened to kill all the hostages if Israel continues the operation. They've also threatened to put the hostages right in front between the Hamas fighters and Israeli attackers, so that they die as well in that process. On top of all that, you then have the massive complexity of the IDF have encountered everywhere else they've been inside Gaza, which is the massive tunnel system underneath Gaza City, the booby traps of very many of the buildings. Obviously, a large number of the buildings have been taken over by Hamas to be used for military as military positions to command operations to attack the IDF for numerous other purposes. That, of course, includes hospitals, mosques, apartment buildings, schools, and all the rest of the stuff we've seen in Gaza City. all of which, or many of which, are going to be
all of the violations of the laws of war,
all war crimes, and in many cases, buildings booby trapped. The booby trapped concealed in the walls, in the ceilings, in the floors, in the pavements outside, in the roads. Many of the booby traps covered by covert cameras to enable the booby traps to be triggered when IDF soldiers approach. All of these things. And actually, I could go on and on about this, but I want John to say something more wise than I am. And I would say that the booby trapping is something that people don't really fully understand. I've been involved in operations, particularly in Northern Ireland, but also elsewhere, where booby traps were used extensively in urban areas. And in one case that I recall, we had to almost completely destroy a building which was absolutely laced with IRA booby traps. And that, I think, explains the devastation of a lot of buildings in Gaza City, which have been hit from the air, from the ground, using, obviously, tanks, using various different forms of explosives to blow the buildings up. Because
there's so many traps and hidden weapons within
there. There are so many booby traps, and if the IDF need to clear an area, let's say of terrorists or of weapons stashes or whatever, then the last thing you want to do, if you can avoid it, is send in soldiers who are going to get killed by these booby traps. We shouldn't forget one thing that is often forgotten: that is that an IDF soldier's life is worth no less than the life of anyone else, and also, the IDF need to conserve their combat power because they've got to use them for fighting Hamas. They can't afford to throw them away just in the interest of keeping a building intact. So, that I think the huge devastation in Gaza and what we're seeing now in Gaza City as well is explained to an extent by that.
So Brian, I'd only add to that really good assessment is that you said, basically IDF have gone in, but you're right. They've left Gaza City pretty much untouched outside of some very targeted raids like Al-Shifa Hospital that Hamas was using, not once, but every time that the IDF clear out of the area. But this is a very concentrated, the densest area of Gaza City that the IDF hasn't touched for many reasons, especially the hostages, but also the complexity of the challenge that it would take to enter a city of this density. And from the beginning of the war, I've kind of been like the urban warfare guy with all these case studies of every urban battle that's come before, going, stop comparing the Gaza war to a single battle. There's so many nuances. But in Gaza City, so the Battle of Gaza City that we're seeing now, there is no parallel where an enemy has prepared the environment for 20 years. All the other basically major urban battles of history are very short amount of time that the defenders got, from Stalingrad to Aachen to the biggest battle since World War II, the Battle of Mosul, where the enemy had 2 years to prepare it. They didn't have 20 years. So just the difficulty of the task, but the hostages present. And Richard's right, Hamas has actually moved hostages into Gaza City to use them as shields. Hamas has actually put out written guidance because the biggest challenge, and I agree with Richard, in any urban warfare is the presence of civilians, because once you enter the urban environment, there is the most restriction on the use of force. And this is where I'm very vocal, and I'll stand by this fact that Israel has done more to prevent civilian harm in urban warfare than any military in history. And we see that every day in Gaza City, where Israel is dropping the flyers, the phone messages, the voicemails, the drones with speakers, the daily pauses to the creation of new humanitarian.
Can you just explain that a bit more, John? Because I think that's lost on people, that they don't know or understand the extent to which Israel alerts the local population, you should leave.
Yeah, I mean, that's really one aspect, and I've laid out like 10 aspects of what Israel does to prevent civilian harm. And since I've studied this for a long time, I know of what we call best practices in civilian harm mitigation. So, of course, a notification, as in tell the civilian population that you're coming, which also tells the enemy you're coming. So recognizing that to do that, you are actually giving up some elements of surprise and that you need in warfare. And Israel does those notifications and then gets criticized for doing it. You can't move civilians out of harm's way when that's pretty much the standard best practice is to notify the civilians before you enter the environment. And Israel does that in spades. And the normal way to do that is to drop these flyers that you see, and you've seen it since October 7th. But Israel does things that no military has ever done, with the calling of everybody in the environment, with the handing out their maps, and then telling the enemy every day, look, today we're going to be in area 801. If you're a civilian in that area, please leave. If you're a civilian who hasn't evacuated, please stay out of this area. The way they do tactical pauses every day. The fact that Israel built new roads during this battle so to allow civilians, despite Hamas putting out orders that if you leave, we will kill you, and setting up roadblocks and everything. The use of certain munitions, and like we see these videos of buildings being dropped in Gaza City right now, right? So Hamas buildings that are used for command and control, for intelligence, for radio communications. Israel will give all the notifications, and they still do this tactic called roof knocking, where if they notify everybody in the building and they don't leave, then they'll drop non-penetrating explosives on the roof and say, look, we're serious. Now what you see is that the Gazans who won't leave will set up cameras because they know that a strike's about to happen on that building, because they've been given hours and hours and days of notification, and they just set their cameras up to get that shot. Recognize that Israel's done all these things that no military's ever done, and recognize what Hamas is doing. And Richard talked about what are the civilians left in Gaza City, right? Most people will just completely wish away what Hamas did during the last temporary ceasefire, which was shove 1 million civilians, force them to leave the safety, more safety in a humanitarian zone, and go back to northern Gaza, so that the IDF would face a challenge if they ever tried to attack Hamas's sanctuary in Gaza City, where the IDF have never gone. And that's what you're seeing. So the right thing to do is to get all those civilians out of harm's way, like every urban battle that's ever happened really in any similar context, while Hamas is stopping them. Layer on all those other challenges that Richard talked about, that every step you take in Gaza, no matter where you are, it is more likely than not that there's a tunnel underneath you and maybe a Hamas fighter underneath you. That's all never happened in history, where there's this city underneath the cities. And there are things in Gaza City that even the IDF can't comprehend, don't know about, because Hamas spent billions of dollars building layer upon layer of tunnels, like Richard said, underground bombs, tunnels with bombs in them, entire buildings that are really bombs in themselves. Every aspect of this is a challenge that no military has faced in really modern history, but if you can go back to history ever. And later on top of, no matter what the IDF does, they're criticized, right? This is November of 2023 when the IDF gave notification after October 7th saying, we're going to northern Gaza. Civilians, please evacuate. And the entire United Nations and Red Cross, everybody says, you can't evacuate civilians. You can't do that. Like, that's the insanity, even when Israel balances the humanitarian concerns above what the law of war, even anything that anybody's ever done before. Israel goes above that, and then they get criticized. So the other challenge that the IDF faced today, of course, is that no matter what they do, somebody will twist it as in something nefarious and evil, when they're just trying to achieve a goal in war that is legitimate by every measure.
One thing I'd add to that about the way in which the IDF have been trying to minimize civilian casualties is that the military commanders, I'm talking about very senior military commanders from armed forces in the West and in the Middle East, whose countries have been accusing Israel of war crimes, their military commanders, their chief of staff, have been into Israel, and they've been consulting with Israelis to find out how the Israelis achieve such extraordinary success at minimizing civilian casualties. So while their political leaders are accusing Israel of being careless of the lives of innocent civilians, the military commanders have been there trying to find out how they should do it themselves if they get the chance. In fact, I visited Israel a couple of years ago with a military group, actually longer than that, before this war began, with a military group examining a previous conflict. And unanimously, these are retired generals from countries around the world, including in Europe, unanimously, they said, the biggest challenge their armies would face in trying to deal with a situation like this is achieving the success Israel had had in minimizing civilian casualties. They simply didn't think they'd be able to do it.
So, as you were talking, gents, I was pulling up on my phone, what's the death toll? Because we're constantly hearing what the death toll is, and the narrative that is repeated over and over again would go against what you're saying, that civilian deaths are minimized. So, Al Jazeera, 1 million in harm's way in Gaza City as Israel escalates attacks. They also say 65,000 people have been killed, 167,000 injured. PBS, 60,000 Palestinians have died. And where else? Oh, UNICEF, 50,000 children have been killed. So 65,000 people are dead, and 50,000 of them are children, according to a United Nations organization that clearly doesn't have the facts. So when you've looked at civilian deaths in this war as compared to others, what have you found?
The first thing I'd say is, I don't think anybody knows how many civilians have died inside Gaza. I certainly don't. You hear these 65,000 figure or 100,000, whatever it might be. And as John pointed out earlier on, these figures all come from Hamas, the Gaza Health Ministry or whatever. And they're all regurgitated from those Hamas figures. And some people quote the UN's figures, say it's following, but the UN's figures come from Hamas. Everyone's figures come from Hamas. So we don't know the reality. What we do know is that a large number of civilians have died, or a large number of people, shall we say, have died inside Gaza. And some of those are civilians. The IDF have estimated, at various points, they've estimated the number of terrorist fighters that they've killed inside Gaza. There's not a kind of, I haven't seen a figure recently from the IDF, but there's occasionally they will say they estimate the following have been killed. But the reality is, on the basis of the IDF figures I've seen, if you take the Hamas figures as being something like the truth, and I'm not saying they are because they're probably not, they're probably grossly exaggerated, then you have to deduct from those figures, the total figures they give you, have to deduct the number of fighters that have been killed, because obviously IDF are going to have killed a lot of fighters. They've been targeting the fighters, not the civilians, and many fighters will have died.
Are they, when they put out these figures, they're counting all the fighters as civilians, aren't they?
Well, yeah. I mean, Hamas are counting everybody in that equation. They don't differentiate between fighters and combatants. Fighters and civilians. They just give an overall figure. Nor do they say how many people have died from natural causes. And in a population of 2 million or whatever it is that Gaza is supposed to have had at the beginning of the conflict, I don't know how many, but a large number are going to have died of natural causes: old age, heart attacks, cancer, some kind of condition unconnected with the war. Now that's all included in the overall equation. But as a very rough rule of thumb, from what I can work out, and I'm not suggesting for a moment this is accurate, and I don't think anyone has an accurate figure, I would guess that the number of civilians that have been killed in this conflict are probably fewer than 50% of the overall total. So you're probably talking about a ratio maybe 1-to-1 civilian to combatants killed. Which sounds terrible. It does sound terrible when you're talking about a war that's aimed to kill combatants only.
But is that normal?
Right. Well, I was going to say, if you compare it to other conflicts, I think the Americans in Afghanistan estimated they killed something in the region of 5 civilians to 1 combatant, and in Iraq, something like 3 civilians to 1 combatant. So when you're fighting it among a civilian population, civilians, tragically and unfortunately, they're going to die. There's no way around it. Some of them are going to die. And more of them are going to die in this kind of conflict when Hamas actually wants them to die. I don't think in Afghanistan and Iraq, maybe with some exceptions, or other combat zones, that the people supposedly fighting against the Americans or whatever actually wanted their own civilians to die, particularly. Some couldn't care less. But in Hamas's case, they want the civilians to die. It's one of their key operational strategies is to want those civilians to die. And if I'm right, and Israel has achieved something like a 1-to-1 ratio, maybe a bit different to that, but if I'm right, then that is, probably a historic low in a conflict of this sort. And I before John jumps in on me and has a go, I would say as well that there has been no conflict of this sort before. So it's not really comparable to other theaters.
So, Brian, I could go on for a very long time, and somehow I became like a numbers guy about this ratio. I can say with strong conviction that question, what is your civilian to combatant ratio, has never been raised in any war against any nation, defending themselves or not. You don't say that about any war that's going on right now. Can I give you all the numbers in the comparisons? Sure. But there's 3 types of lies in my work. And I've been doing this for a long time. And I actually write case studies where I search for the number. And there's 3 types of lies in my work. Lies, damn lies, and statistics. Just on what the statistics you gave, of course, we can ask the question of like, it doesn't even say combatants or Hamas. It just says this number of Palestinians have died. And until they give me the list of died of natural causes, I'm going to start questioning the number. As a war researcher, I can tell you there's never been a battle. And there's a big difference between a battle and a war where somebody had a daily running number of the people who have died, period, let alone combatants, non-combatants, a daily running number of who's dying day to day, down to the single digit like Hamas can magically do. It just never happened for a whole list of reasons let alone who's counting the body. I was like, okay, that body, that was a Hamas guy, that it was an innocent civilian. Or what Hamas was doing, which was taking social media posts of people missing that their families couldn't find. They opened a Google share drive where you could put somebody's name on it. They go to the list. I want people to get out of this numbers game. It's not how war works. The number one question that if I was a politician looking at these numbers would say, okay, this is awful. What is Israel doing to prevent civilian death? Okay, more than anybody else in history. Okay. Is there any evidence of Israel violating the laws of war and targeting civilians? As in, that's their objective. That's where they shot at. The answer is no. Okay, let's look at the legitimate targets that they're engaging. And then what measures did they take to limit civilian deaths? Yes, Brian, I can give you all the statistics that you want, like the Korean War, where 2 million civilians die and less than 100,000 combatants. 2 million civilians, that's 54,000 civilians dying a month, every month of the Korean War, if we did the numbers that way, but it's not how it works. These numbers, even the aggregating of the numbers, and that's what they're doing in Gaza, right? So if I took the Battle of Rafah, right, the whole all eyes on Rafah, don't go to Rafah, where Israel did all the same civilian harm mitigation measures that they have since October 7th, if you looked at just those numbers, it would be 100 combatants to 1 civilian death. The numbers are so low of civilian deaths in Rafah that nobody wants to talk about it. They just want to aggregate all the numbers from October 7th because they're counting Palestinian terrorists who died in Israel on October 7th in their list. They just aggregate the number and say, look at this number. Of course, it's awful. And then they'll do the kids thing, right? Because this is where I get in arguments of, John, 20,000 children. I'm like, one, if you take itemized Hamas's list, it doesn't have that many children by your definition of children, which is 18 and below. And look, I joined the military. I know Richard did a long time ago. At a very young age, when I was 17, I would have been on the list had I died in this war. It's just, it disregards all facts and takes a number and tries to make that the social problem. Irrelevant of, 200,000 to die in the Iraq war, the 400,000 Yemen, like all these other numbers, but the comparisons don't work, right? Because they're war versus battle. What Hamas is doing, Hamas has killed thousands of civilians. 20% of the 15,000 rockets that Hamas has launched have landed inside of Gaza, killing Gazan civilians who go on the list. Everybody just blames Israel for this number. It's not true. The number's not true. It could be more, it could be less. I can tell you that I don't mourn the death of Hamas combatants. I don't. Israel views every civilian casualty as tragic, as like awful. Hamas views it as their strategy, and they state they want the death. They don't state that they don't want it. They want the death of every child, elderly person, everything, so they can achieve their goal in the afterlife.
I'll just tell you a brief story from a previous conflict.
Sure.
I think it was the 2014 Gaza war, when Hamas put out figures, similar, okay, obviously on a much smaller scale, but they put out the figures. And effectively their figures were that all the people that Israel had killed had been civilians. And there was then an uproar after the conflict was finished. There was an uproar among the Gazan population. We thought Hamas was there to protect us, but Hamas didn't lose any fighters in this war. It was all civilians. And Hamas then put out a revised version admitting that they had lost quite a large number of their fighters and reducing the civilian death toll. So this is the kind of thing that we're having to deal with. It's really anything that comes out of Hamas, whatever it says, I think really ought to be just ignored.
October 17th, 2023, Gaza officials say 500 killed in Israeli airstrike on hospital. That was a Palestinian Jihad rocket that missed its target. And by the way, 500 people still didn't die. It landed in a parking lot. I'm not sure if anybody died in that strike, but the whole world was told that 500 had died. Our then Foreign Affairs Minister, Melanie Joly, denounced that, and it's still up on her X feed. She has never taken that down. There's a bunch of politicians in Canada who denounced Israel for a war crime and killing 500 people who never died.
Yeah, and if you remember that event, I remember it very vividly. It wasn't just Hamas, like the Gaza Health Ministry spokesman unit that said that. The actual doctors of that hospital, the Ahali Hospital, held a news conference that night before the world could see the explosion, which was a pothole in the parking lot. They held a news conference where they emptied the morgue of anybody dead and had men holding babies in front of them as they gave a news conference talking about the hundreds that had just been killed in the strike that hit the hospital. But then, of course, everything that comes out of anybody in Gaza is taking over the word of reality, even satellite images on that case. But I remember vividly this emotional news conference that the doctors gave with men holding babies at the base of the thing. Who does that? Who does that?
Doctor's word is the law. The doctor's is often quoted. If a doctor says this, you've got to be right. It's almost like a religious leader. Well, we shouldn't forget that the second leader of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, was a surgeon. We shouldn't forget that a few years back, there was a terrorist attack in Glasgow Airport, which was conducted by a doctor who tried to blow up Glasgow Airport. We shouldn't also forget that the family of a doctor was holding, at least one doctor was holding Israeli hostages inside Gaza. So I don't believe a doctor any more than I believe Hamas.
So you've talked a lot about the mitigation measures, and as I've listened to each of you, it kind of sounds like Israel's fighting with one hand tied behind their backs. And they're doing that to try and make sure that civilians don't die because of the increased scrutiny they face. But in some ways, isn't this prolonging the war and a lot of the suffering that's going on?
I think it has prolonged the war, and there are three things that have prolonged the war. And I would say the first one is the presence of civilians inside Gaza. As you said, that basically it has such a big impact on the way that the war is conducted. Without them, if they had been moved, as John suggested, to Egypt, or many of them moved to Egypt, the war, I think, would have been over long before now. Secondly, of course, the Israeli hostages that are present. And their presence has also severely restricted or severely controlled the way that the IDF have had to fight, equally as much as the civilians have. And then thirdly has been, I think, international politics. And the only key player really in this war outside of Israel and the Israel's enemies is the United States of America. Whatever, with all due respect to Canada and Britain and France, etc., what their leaders say doesn't really make much difference to anything. But the US does. And unfortunately, President Biden, when he was running the US, he caused some pretty severe delays to Israel's prosecution of the war, including, as John mentioned, what went on down in Rafah in the south. Fortunately, we now have, and I know that President Trump has mixed reviews in Canada, but Fortunately, President Trump, I think, is taking a far more robust, strong line in support of Israel on this. And so that constraint's been gone. But I think, without the hostages, without the civilian population, I think this war would have been pretty much done long, long before now.
Yeah, I think history would validate that, what Richard says. I mean, it's from anybody who studies war, they would know that any other country would have done this differently, but no other country would be forced to do it this way, with that hand tied behind their back, with the door closed for civilian. The fact that the hostages is a big part of this, and every time that Israel has actually shown immense military movement, then there's a pause because Hamas will try to negotiate for more time and set the conditions for its strategy to include this propaganda war. But you have to account for other factors like the Hamas leadership in Qatar, the billionaires who are running the show, being given sanctuary in Qatar and being the negotiators for all of these terms. Then you have to factor in the other existential threats to Israel since October 7th that they've had to fight and succeed against during this war. Like, so Israel thinks that, although it's this small country, the world thinks Israel's all this all-powerful military that can do, space lasers and just get the job done, as it had to fight Hezbollah, this massive military of 100,000 rockets, 100,000 soldiers, and then another nation state, much, much larger, launching historic level of cruise missiles on top of them. Israel, there's so many factors that have protracted the actual removal of Hamas from power and the demilitarizing of the Gaza Strip. Of course, the international aspect, even the United Nations at time, or the United States saying the correct number of civilian casualties in Gaza is 0. A U.S. official said that, and that was ridiculous, because that means, based on the domestic politics right now, we need you to stop. Just stop everything. Yeah. That's the crazy aspect, but there's so many elements here that have protracted this war. The humanitarian aid thing that, when the UN stopped picking up trucks for its own reasons, there's so many people you can point the finger at, but there's only one finger pointed at Israel, who's this small little nation trying to get its hostages back and survive attack, like a legitimate attack. And I think that's one of the most ridiculous things that I've seen that the United Nations put their name on, was this so-called unbiased commissions that said that October 7th wasn't an existential threat and didn't warrant a large-scale combat operation in response. Like, that's one of the worst things I've heard of since I've ever studied war. The invasion of Israel, the attack of Hamas, the attack that Hezbollah joined wasn't an existential threat and didn't warrant a military self-defense response is insanity.
I was going to wrap it there, gents, but John, you mentioned Qatar, so quick comment from both of you. Israel being denounced for trying to take out leadership hiding in Qatar. Now, they didn't get the people that they wanted to. They didn't take out all the billionaires that you mentioned, but is there legitimacy in what they did, or was that a violation of international order or laws of war?
I think it's absolutely legitimate, and these people were involved in directing the war in Gaza. They were involved in ordering the war in Gaza, and they were playing a direct function in combat. And therefore, wherever they were in the world, I mean, I think the only question you could raise is, given that they're in a different sovereign country, would be maybe you could make representations on that sovereign country to hand over those people, which obviously Qatar wouldn't do. But assuming that wasn't going to happen, I don't know if Israel made any attempt to do that, but assuming that wasn't going to happen, this operation was entirely legitimate. And whether I don't know exactly who it killed and didn't kill at the moment. No doubt we'll find that out at some point. But the reality is it terrified the Hamas leadership, and Hamas now know that there's nowhere in the world they can go where they're going to be safe, the Hamas leadership. And that has had a significant impact on the way Hamas will fight in the future. And not only that, but also Hamas inside Gaza, they will be feeling even more isolated than they felt before. Yes, of course, people like Prime Minister Carney and Prime Minister Starmer and Macron have done their best to make them feel not isolated anymore. But they are isolated. they've had one of their primary sponsors, Iran, severely damaged by Israel's 12-day war against Iran. They've now seen their leadership in Qatar hit by a series of attacks. And so that must have an impact on their fighting morale, which is extremely important, I think. And the final thing I'd say on that subject is that it's a lesson that I think benefits all of us, because jihadists everywhere, they are going to fight. They're not just going to fight against countries like ours from within our country. They're going to have sponsors outside. They're going to use support outside. And they do need to know that there is the likelihood, or at least the possibility, certainly if Israel's involved, that they're not going to be safe wherever they might be.
Brian, I've spent a lot of time recently having to give people war 101 classes, and if somebody in the Canadian government needs it, let me know. The idea that this strike would be illegal in some way or a violation of the law of armed conflict is just false. You don't even have to look post 9/11. Just 2 weeks ago, or last week, the United States took out a ISIS leader in Syria by airstrike. The idea that it is illegal under the law of armed conflict, and I wrote the article recently explaining it for people that need to see it in print. It's just crazy that you think that targeting an enemy commander who happens to be in somebody else's country is some type of law of war violation is not true in any of the sense, let alone recent history where it's been done many, many times. It was absolutely legitimate and a long past due, in my opinion.
Gentlemen, we could go on and on, I'm sure, but it's been a pleasure speaking with both of you, and look forward to perhaps doing it again, but hopefully with the war being over. Thanks so much.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Thank you, Brian.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Proulx, theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Please remember to hit the subscribe button and share this with your friends on social media, wherever you can. Help us out by leaving us a review or a recommendation. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.
Here's that clip from Canada Did What? I Promised You. Imagine yourself inside a Boeing 767 operated by Air Canada. It's July 1983, you're traveling between Montreal and Edmonton, and a couple hours into the flight, the comforting roar of its two jet engines suddenly stop, and most of the power cuts out.
Good evening. It was a metric mix-up. Air Canada has confirmed the plane that landed at Gimli, Manitoba last Saturday ran out of gas because of an error in metric conversion.
I regret to inform you that you're inside the Gimli glider, one of history's only incidents of a civilian airliner running out of gas in the middle of the sky. And this happened because someone didn't know how to properly measure out enough jet fuel. Now, I mention the Gimli glider only to note that systems of measure are not just numbers on a page. They're cultural objects. They might not be on par with language or religion, but they're ways of understanding the world around us. And if you screw with them, even with the best of intentions, you might get the occasional airliner falling out of the sky. Fortunately, in this instance, it miraculously worked out fine. The pilots in control of this particular Air Canada flight just happened to be two of the only people on Earth perfectly suited to safely bring down a crippled full-size airliner in the middle of Manitoba. One of them was an experienced glider pilot. The other one was a former Royal Canadian Air Force pilot who just happened to have served at a Manitoba airbase that was now directly underneath them. If you want to hear the rest of the story, make sure you subscribe to Canada Did What? Everywhere you get your podcasts.